Think you know the whole story? Turns out you were probably taught the half-truth. Welcome to Half-Truths. Close your eyes for a moment and go back to your fourth-grade classroom. You are sitting at a laminate desk, perhaps staring at a pull-down map or a spinning globe in the corner of the room. Your teacher is walking you through the Hall of Fame of the Age of Discovery. You learn about Christopher Columbus and 1492. You learn about Vasco da Gama. And then you learn the big one, the man who did the impossible. The man whose name is synonymous with the very concept of going all the way around the world, Ferdinand Magellan. The story goes something like this. In 1519, a brave Portuguese explorer, sailing for the Spanish crown, set out with 5 ships. He possessed an iron will and a brilliant navigational mind. He sailed across the Atlantic, found a secret passage around the tip of South America, crossed the vast Pacific Ocean, and triumphantly returned to Spain, having proven once and for all that the Earth was a sphere and that all the oceans were connected. He was the first circumnavigator, a titan of history. It is a neat, tidy, and inspiring story of human achievement. It is the kind of story we love to tell because it has a clear protagonist, a clear goal, and a clear victory. We name space probes after him. We name GPS systems after him. We name galaxies after him. His name is shorthand for completion. But there is just one massive, glaring problem with that story. A problem that your 4th grade teacher probably glossed over or forgot to mention entirely. Ferdinand Magellan never circumnavigated the globe. He did not make it back to Spain. He did not pop the champagne when the ship docked in Seville. He did not receive the glory in his lifetime. In fact, Ferdinand Magellan died a violent, arguably avoidable death in the Philippines only halfway through the journey. He famously underestimated the size of the Pacific Ocean, but he also fatally underestimated the people he encountered on the other side of it. So, if the captain died halfway through the movie, who actually finished the story? Who are the real first circumnavigators? And why have we spent 500 years giving the credit to a man whose corpse was left hacking in the surf on a beach in Mactan, thousands of miles from the finish line? Welcome to the story of the greatest sailing feat in history, and the man who didn't actually complete it. This is the story of the Armada de Malacca, a voyage of mutiny, starvation, torture, and accidental triumph. We are going to find out how a slave named Enrique and a mutineer named Juan Sebastián Elcano accomplished what the great Magellan could not, and why history decided to print the legend instead of the truth. To understand why the myth of Magellan is so sticky, we have to understand the world he lived in. We are talking about the early 16th century. This was the era of the spice race. Spices like cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon were not just flavorings back then. They were the oil of their day. They were preservatives, status symbols, and medicines. They were worth their weight in gold, quite literally. The problem for Europe was geography and politics. The Spice Islands, which we now know as the Moluccas in modern-day Indonesia, were incredibly far away. Portugal had locked down the eastern route around Africa. If you wanted spices, you had to play by Portuguese rules. Enter Ferdinand Magellan. He was Portuguese by birth, a veteran soldier who had actually been to the Spice Islands before, traveling the normal way via the east. But Magellan had a falling out with the King of Portugal. He was stubborn, proud, and reportedly quite difficult to like. When the Portuguese king refused to increase his pension, Magellan did the unthinkable. He defected. He went next door to Spain and pitched a radical idea to the teenager who would become Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Magellan's pitch was simple. He claimed he could find a shortcut. He believed there was a strait, a passage through the Americas, that would allow Spanish ships to sail west, cross the ocean, and arrive at the Spice Islands without violating Portuguese waters. It was a gamble. No one knew if this strait existed. No one knew how big the ocean on the other side was. But Charles V was young and hungry for cash, so he gave Magellan the green light. This is where the legend begins to form. We see Magellan as the visionary, the man who saw the geometry of the world when others saw dragons on the map. And to be fair, Magellan was incredibly competent. He organized an armada of 5 ships and about 270 men. He stocked them with hardtack, wine, and weapons. But the myth suggests that this was a unified mission of discovery. The reality was that it was a powder keg from day one. The Spanish captains hated Magellan because he was Portuguese. They viewed him as a traitor and a foreigner. Before they even left the dock, the seeds of mutiny were sown. The story we learn in school paints Magellan as a beloved leader. The historical record shows he was a paranoid disciplinarian who slept in his armor because he was terrified his own officers would murder him in his sleep. They set sail in September 1519, and for the first year, things went terribly. They didn't find the shortcut immediately. They sailed down the coast of South America, poking into every river mouth, hoping it was the passage to the Orient, only to find dead ends. As winter set in, they had to make camp in Patagonia, in modern-day Argentina. This is where the shiny veneer of the Magellan myth really starts to crack. The crew was freezing. They were on reduced rations, and the Spanish captains decided they had had enough. On Easter Sunday, 1520, a full-blown mutiny broke out. 3 of the 5 ships turned against Magellan. Now, in the sterilized version of history, we skip this part, but it is crucial to understanding the man. Magellan didn't talk them down with inspiring speeches. He crushed the mutiny with brutal efficiency. He sent a small boat to one of the rebel ships with a letter, and while the captain was reading it, Magellan's men stabbed him in the neck. Magellan then had the body of another mutinous captain drawn and quartered, displaying the body parts on stakes to terrify the crew. He even marooned a priest and another officer on a desert island, leaving them to die. This was not a gentle voyage of scientific inquiry. It was a desperate, violent survival situation. But Magellan won. He regained control. And to his credit, he eventually found what he was looking for. In October 1520, he found the opening of a channel near the bottom of the continent. We call it the Strait of Magellan today. Navigating it was a nightmare. It is a maze of fjords, unpredictable winds, and freezing water. It took them over a month to pick their way through. During this time, the captain of the ship San Antonio deserted, turning around and fleeing back to Spain with a significant portion of the expedition's food. So now Magellan is down to 3 ships, but he pops out the other side. He enters a new ocean. It was so calm compared to the Atlantic that he named it Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea, the Pacific Ocean. This is the moment of triumph in the textbook. He found the route. He proved the continents were separate, but this is actually where the tragedy begins. Magellan calculated that the Spice Islands were just a few weeks away. He thought the Pacific was a small body of water. He was catastrophically wrong. The Pacific Ocean covers 1/3 of the planet's surface. It is larger than all of Earth's land masses combined, and Magellan was sailing blindly into the middle of it. For 3 months and 20 days, they saw nothing but water. The food ran out. The water turned into yellow, putrid sludge. The description of this crossing from the expedition's chronicler, Antonio Pigafetta, is the stuff of nightmares. He wrote that they ate biscuit powder that was swarming with worms and smelled of rat urine. They soaked the leather coverings of the rigging in the ocean for days to soften them, then grilled the leather and ate it. They ate sawdust. Rats became a luxury food item, sold between sailors for high prices. Scurvy ravaged the crew. Their gums swelled so much that they covered their teeth, making it impossible to eat even the leather or the sawdust. 19 men died of starvation and sickness. It was a floating horror show. When they finally spotted land in March 1521, they were skeletons. They landed in Guam, had a disastrous misunderstanding with the locals that resulted in Magellan burning down a village and killing people, and then quickly moved on. Finally, they reached the Philippines. They had crossed the Pacific. This was an incredible feat of endurance. But notice something important. They haven't circled the world yet. They are in Southeast Asia. To circle the world, they have to get back to Spain, and this is where Magellan makes the decision that erases him from the finish line. Magellan was a man of immense hubris. He was deeply religious and believed he was on a divine mission. When he arrived in the Philippines, specifically the island of Cebu, he befriended the local ruler, Raja Humabon. Magellan began converting the locals to Christianity. He baptized the Raja and his queen. He was acting less like a captain trying to get his cargo home and more like a messianic conqueror. To solidify this new alliance, Magellan offered to destroy one of the Raja's enemies. There was a local chief on the nearby island of Mactan named Lapu-Lapu. Lapu-Lapu refused to bow to the Spanish king or the Christian god. Magellan's officers begged him not to go. They said, "Sir, we are spice traders. We are explorers. We are not an army." But Magellan was high on his own legend. He believed that one European soldier was worth 100 local warriors. He told his men that God would grant them victory. On the morning of April 27, 1521, Magellan took a small force of 49 men to Mactan. He wanted to shock and awe the locals. He told his allies, the Cebuano warriors, to stay in their boats and watch. He wanted to show off. But the tide was out. The Spanish ships couldn't get close to the shore, meaning their cannons were out of range. Magellan and his men had to wade through thigh-deep water for hundreds of yards to reach the beach. Waiting for them were 1,500 warriors led by Lapu-Lapu. It wasn't a battle, it was a swarm. The Europeans were weighed down by armor. Their muskets took forever to reload, and once they fired, they were useless. The Mactan warriors recognized Magellan as the leader. They targeted him. Pigafetta, who was fighting right beside him, describes the scene. A bamboo spear struck Magellan in the face. He ran a local warrior through with his lance, but it got stuck. He tried to draw his sword, but he couldn't lift his arm because a javelin had wounded it. The warriors rushed him. They hacked at him with scimitars. They overwhelmed him. And there in the surf, Ferdinand Magellan died. The great explorer, the man of destiny, cut down because of an unnecessary ego trip on an island he wasn't even supposed to be visiting. His body was never recovered. Lapu-Lapu kept it as a trophy of war. So here we are. It is April 1521. The expedition is in shambles. The leader is dead. They are halfway around the world. Who finishes the trip? This is where the great man history fails us, and the real history gets fascinating. After Magellan's death, things got even worse. The Rajah of Cebu, seeing that the Europeans weren't invincible gods after all, turned on them. He invited the remaining officers to a feast and massacred them. The survivors scrambled back to the ships and fled. They now had too few men to sail 3 ships, so they made the heartbreaking decision to burn the ship Concepcion. They transferred the supplies and the men to the Trinidad and the Victoria. For months, they wandered around Indonesia as pirates, looking for the Spice Islands. They finally found them, loaded up with cloves and prepared to head home. But then, disaster struck again. The Trinidad, Magellan's flagship, began to leak uncontrollably. It couldn't make the journey. It had to stay behind for repairs. That left one ship, the Victoria. The Victoria was the smallest of the original 5 ships. It was battered, leaking, and worm-eaten. And who was the captain chosen to lead this final, desperate leg of the journey? Juan Sebastián Elcano. If you are wondering who that is, you are not alone. Most history books relegate him to a footnote, but Elcano is the man who actually did it. And here is the irony. Elcano was one of the mutineers back in Patagonia. He had been part of the uprising against Magellan. He had been in chains, but because Magellan needed every skilled sailor he could get, he had pardoned Elcano and put him back to work. Now, the former mutineer was the captain. Elcano faced an impossible choice. He could try to go back across the Pacific, which was suicide, or he could continue west, through the Indian Ocean and around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. The problem was that the entire African route was controlled by the Portuguese. If they were caught, they would be arrested and likely executed as thieves. Elcano chose the Portuguese route. He decided to circumnavigate. The journey of the Victoria under Elcano is one of the greatest feats of seamanship ever recorded. They had to sail far to the south, deep into the uncharted waters of the southern Indian Ocean, to avoid Portuguese patrols. They were sailing a rotting ship through storms that would break a modern vessel. Food ran out again. Men began to die again. They were so desperate that when they finally reached the Cape Verde Islands near Africa, they pretended to be coming from the Americas just to buy rice from the Portuguese. But they were discovered. The Portuguese realized they were carrying spices from the east. The Victoria had to flee the harbor, leaving 13 men behind on the dock. On September 6, 1522, 3 years after they left, the Victoria limped into the harbor of Sanlúcar de Barrameda in Spain. It was a ghost ship. The sails were in tatters. The wood was bleached white. Of the roughly 270 men who had left with Magellan, only 18 skeleton-like figures walked off the Victoria. They were so weak they could barely stand. They walked barefoot, carrying candles, to a nearby church to give thanks. Juan Sebastián Elcano was the captain. He was the one who brought the ship home. He was the one who completed the circle. The King of Spain awarded him a coat of arms featuring a globe and the Latin inscription, Primus circumdedesti me, you went around me first. So technically, legally, and historically, Elcano is the first captain to circumnavigate the globe in a single voyage. But wait, I promised you a record scratch moment. I promised you a half-truth, because there is a very strong argument that neither Magellan nor Elcano was the actual first person to travel around the world. That title might belong to a man whose name was likely not even Enrique. When Magellan was in Malacca, in modern-day Malaysia, years before this expedition, he purchased a slave. This man was likely from Sumatra or the Moluccas. Magellan had him baptized and gave him the Christian name Enrique. Enrique was with Magellan for everything. He went from Asia to Portugal with Magellan. He went from Portugal to Spain. He crossed the Atlantic. He survived the mutiny. He survived the starvation in the Pacific. When the expedition reached the Philippines, something incredible happened. They encountered small boats of local people. Magellan tried to speak to them, but they didn't understand. Then Enrique spoke, and the locals understood him. They were speaking a dialect of Malay, the trade language of the region. Think about the geometry of that moment. Enrique had been born in Southeast Asia. He had traveled west to Europe, then west again across the Atlantic and Pacific, until he arrived back in the region of his birth. Depending on exactly where Enrique was born, and we don't know for sure, the moment he stepped off that ship in the Philippines or spoke to those locals, he may have completed a full personal circumnavigation of the globe. He closed his own loop. And he did it weeks before Magellan died, and more than a year before Elcano dragged the Victoria back to Spain. What happened to Enrique? After Magellan died, Enrique was instrumental in the massacre of the Spanish officers in Cebu. Magellan's will had stipulated that upon his death, Enrique should be freed, but the new commanders refused to release him. So, Enrique allegedly plotted with the local Raja to kill the Spanish masters. After the massacre, Enrique disappears from the historical record. He stayed behind in Cebu. Did he live out his days as a free man in his home region? We hope so. But his story highlights the Eurocentric bias of our history books. We celebrate the European captain who died halfway, but we ignore the enslaved Asian man who likely circled the world first, simply by trying to get home. So, why do we still say Magellan circumnavigated the globe? Part of it is the great man theory of history. It's easier to teach a story about one visionary leader than a story about a mutinous committee that barely survived. Magellan was the architect. He had the vision. Even though he failed to execute the final leg, the expedition was his idea. Another reason is the source material. The main diary of the voyage was written by Antonio Pigafetta. Pigafetta worshipped Magellan. He hated Elcano. In his final report to the king, Pigafetta heaped praise on the fallen Magellan and barely mentioned Elcano's heroism in bringing the ship home. Pigafetta wrote the first draft of history, and he wrote it to glorify his dead friend. But the truth is far more compelling than the myth. The truth is that the first circumnavigation wasn't a victory lap. It was a disaster. It was a story of human error, ego, and incredible suffering. It wasn't achieved by a singular hero in a clean uniform. It was achieved by a ragged group of starving survivors, led by a mutineer and aided by a slave who just refused to give up. Magellan broke the lock. He opened the door, but he didn't walk through it. The next time you see a globe or hear someone use the phrase Magellanic to describe a great journey, remember the Victoria. Remember the 18 ghosts who walked off that ship. And remember Enrique, the man who spoke the language of home after traveling the long way around. History is rarely a straight line drawn by a conqueror. It is a circle drawn by those who survive. The world is round, but the stories we tell about it are often flat. It's worth checking the other side. Now you know the real story. What other half-truths are still out there? If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, and join us next time. Until then, stay curious.